Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a phrasal verb that we found in a podcast script about, well, phrasal verbs.
Meta much.
Right. It's take on. And what's fascinating is it has like 6 completely different meanings.
That is a lot for just 2 little words.
Exactly. So get ready to add a secret weapon to your communication arsenal, because once you master this one, you're going to sound so much more fluent.
You know, it's remarkable how much nuance can be packed into a simple phrasal verb.
I know. It shows that they're not just like verbs plus prepositions. They really create entirely new meanings.
Absolutely. Take and on their own are pretty straightforward. But when you put them together, whoa.
Right. They become like linguistic chameleons.
That's a great way to put it.
So meaning number 1, as the script lays out for us, is to accept responsibility or a task.
Sounds a bit formal, doesn't it?
Yeah, but think about it. It's that feeling of stepping up to the plate, taking on something new, maybe a bit outside your comfort zone.
It's all about growth, like pushing your boundaries, saying yes to opportunities, even if they feel a little intimidating.
Oh, yeah, like bring it on. Have you taken on any big challenges lately?
Oh, always. But the script uses a more work-related example. It says, she decided to take on more work to help her team meet the deadline.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. It's about going above and beyond, and that can be pretty rewarding.
Exactly.
Okay, meaning number 2, to hire or employ.
Ah, yes. Like a company that's expanding, bringing in new people.
Totally. Fresh perspectives. Think about it, listener. If you're job hunting or thinking about switching careers, this is a good one to know.
The script uses the example the company is taking on new employees for the holiday season.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect illustration. Opportunity and expansion all wrapped up in take on.
Exactly.
Okay, ready for meaning number 3?
Hit me with it.
This is where things get exciting. Take on, meaning to compete against or even to confront.
Ah, yes. This one's got some energy to it. I'm picturing like a boxing match ready to face an opponent head on.
Me too.
It's funny because the script actually uses a boxing example. It says, the boxer was ready to take on his rival in the championship.
I know. It's so vivid. But I think taking on challenges happens every day, not just in sports.
Absolutely. Deadlines, difficult conversations, maybe even, facing a fear you've been avoiding.
So true. What challenges have you had to take on lately? I'm curious to hear what our listener is taking on too.
Well, as for me.
Okay, meaning number 4, take on can also mean to acquire or to adopt. Like, think about it, a project that suddenly takes on this new urgency.
Ooh, I like that. Or someone who takes on a leadership role.
Yes. It's like this shift in energy, a transformation. And it's not just things or tasks, right? You can also take on a new perspective or a new way of thinking.
That's a great point. It's about that internal shift too.
Right. So many layers to this phrasal verb. Speaking of taking things on, meaning number 5 adds a touch of humor. It's when take on means to become emotional, sometimes maybe even overreacting a little.
Oh, we've all been there. That moment you realize you've taken on way too much stress over something that, in hindsight, was pretty minor.
The script reminds us, don't take on so much it's not as bad as it seems. It's like a little reality check.
A gentle reminder to keep things in perspective.
Exactly.
Do you ever feel like you take on too much, especially when you're traveling?
Oh, all the time. Like worrying about missed flights or lost luggage, it's ridiculous.
I know what you mean.
Which brings us perfectly to the final meaning of take on. And this one's a bit more specific. To board passengers or cargo.
Ah, yes. It's definitely more specialized, but still very relevant. Think about all the planes, trains, ships.
Right. The whole world of transportation and logistics relies on this meaning of take on.
The script gives the example. The ship will take on supplies at the next port.
It's like even inanimate objects can take on things. That's so cool.
Isn't it?
So we've covered a lot of ground here just with these 6 meanings of take on. But what I find really interesting is that phrasal verbs can be tricky for English learners, but they're also the key to sounding more natural and fluent.
Absolutely. It's like unlocking this hidden level of the language.
So tell me, why are phrasal verbs so tricky, and why are they so important for sounding like a native speaker?
Well, for starters, they're often idiomatic, meaning you can't always figure out the meaning just by looking at the individual words.
Yeah, take on is a perfect example of that.
Right. Each word is simple enough on its own, but together they create this whole new concept.
It's like a linguistic puzzle, but I guess that's also what makes them so interesting.
Exactly. It's like cracking a code. Once you understand how phrasal verbs work, you unlock this deeper level of fluency that goes beyond textbook grammar.
So true. So, what are some tips for our listener who wants to master phrasal verbs? Where should they even begin?
Well, the good news is there are tons of resources out there that can help. Online dictionaries often have specific sections dedicated to phrasal verbs with clear definitions and examples. And of course, listening to podcasts like this one can help familiarize you with different phrasal verbs and how they're used.
Right, but what about like real life practice?
That's key too. Honestly, one of the best ways to learn phrasal verbs is by immersing yourself in real conversations. Listen to how native speakers use them naturally in context.
Like eavesdropping, but for a good cause.
Exactly. Pay attention to how those phrasal verbs fit into the flow of conversation, and you'll start to internalize them.
I love that. So, dictionaries, podcasts, real life conversations, those are all great starting points. Now, before we move on, I think it would be helpful to just quickly recap the 6 meanings of take on to really cement them in our minds.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so first up we have accepting responsibility or a task, that feeling of stepping up to the plate.
Then there's hiring or employing, bringing in new talent to a company or organization.
Number 3 was all about competition and confrontation, think boxing match, but also facing any challenge head on.
And then we have acquiring or adopting, taking on new qualities, roles, or even perspectives.
Don't forget number 5, which is all about becoming emotional, maybe a little too much sometimes.
Ah, yes. That reminder to not take on too much emotional baggage.
Exactly. Keep things in perspective. And last but not least, the more specialized meaning of boarding passengers or cargo.
Planes, trains, and automobiles.
Exactly. It's amazing how much ground we've covered with just these 2 little words, take on. What stood out to you the most, or what did you find particularly interesting? What about you, listener?
I'm fascinated by how take on can be both active and passive. Sometimes it's about taking charge, and other times it's about accepting what's given.
That's a really interesting point. It's like it reflects the duality of life itself.
Right.
And it makes me think that learning phrasal verbs isn't just about memorizing definitions. It's about understanding how language reflects the complexity of our experiences.
I completely agree. It's about developing that intuitive sense of what sounds natural and authentic.
Right. And that takes time and practice. So for our listener who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, don't worry. It's a journey, not a race.
Exactly. Just experiment with language, have fun with it, and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
So true. So for our listener who's learning English, mastering phrasal verbs is like a superpower.
Absolutely. It's like having this secret code to unlock the full potential of the language. It can feel overwhelming, though, with so many phrasal verbs out there.
Okay, so before we get into tips for mastering phrasal verbs, you mentioned earlier that they can vary depending on culture or region. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating, really. You see, while the core meanings might stay consistent, the way phrasal verbs are actually used, the nuances, the little shades of meaning they carry, those can change depending on where you are in the English-speaking world.
So it's almost like there are dialects of phrasal verbs, too.
You could say that. Like, for instance, you might hear take on used more frequently in British English than in American English. Or, there might be certain slang terms or expressions that use take on in unique ways depending on the region.
So it really is like a secret code within a secret code.
Exactly. It adds a whole new layer of intrigue to language learning.
Okay, so we've established that phrasal verbs can be tricky on their own, but now we're adding cultural and regional variations into the mix. It's a lot to take on, wouldn't you say? How can our listener even begin to navigate this intricate world of phrasal verbs?
Well, I think the key is to be a curious listener and a curious learner. The more you expose yourself to different dialects and accents, the more you'll start to pick up on those subtle differences.
So like watching movies and TV shows from different English-speaking countries, listening to podcasts with hosts from various backgrounds.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions if you hear someone use a phrasal verb in a way that's unfamiliar. Most people are happy to explain, and it's a great way to learn.
I love that. Curiosity really is key. Are there any resources you recommend for someone who's feeling a bit lost in the world of phrasal verbs?
Oh, absolutely. One of the simplest but most effective tools is a good online dictionary. One that has a dedicated section for phrasal verbs. They usually provide clear definitions, examples, sometimes even audio pronunciations, so you can hear how they're supposed to sound.
And of course, we can't forget about podcasts like this one, where we try to break down complex language concepts in a fun and engaging way.
Right. But beyond dictionaries and podcasts, reading is another fantastic way to learn phrasal verbs.
Reading, like books and articles.
Exactly. When you come across a phrasal verb you don't recognize, don't just skim over it. Look it up. Try to understand how it's being used in that specific sentence. It'll help you build your vocabulary and get a feel for how phrasal verbs function in different contexts.
Okay, so we've got dictionaries, podcasts, and reading those are all great passive learning strategies. But what about active practice? Are there any techniques or strategies that our listener can use to really solidify their understanding of phrasal verbs?
You know those flashcards you probably use to study for tests in school? Well, they can be incredibly helpful for learning phrasal verbs too.
Flashcards. That takes me back.
It's a classic study method for a reason. Write the phrasal verb on one side of the card and its meaning on the other. You can quiz yourself, or even better, have a friend quiz you. It's a great way to reinforce what you've learned.
That's a great idea. It's simple, but effective. What about mnemonics or memory tricks? Are those helpful for remembering phrasal verbs?
They can be. If you're a visual learner, try creating a vivid image or even a funny story that connects the phrasal verb to its meaning. For example, for take on, meaning to accept responsibility, you could picture yourself literally taking on a giant backpack filled with tasks and responsibilities.
Oh, I love that. It's like turning language learning into a creative exercise. So we've got flashcards, mnemonics, and of course the all-important practice of using phrasal verbs in real conversations. But what about those cultural and regional variations we talked about earlier? How can our listener navigate those differences without getting totally lost?
That's where immersing yourself in different forms of media can be really helpful. Watch movies and TV shows from different English-speaking countries. Listen to music with diverse lyrics. Try to find podcasts or audiobooks with hosts from various regions. You'll start to pick up on those subtle variations in pronunciation and usage without even realizing it.
It's like training your ear to be more attuned to the nuances of the language.
Exactly. And remember, making mistakes is a natural part of the learning process. Don't be afraid to experiment with different phrasal verbs and see how native speakers react. You might be surprised at how understanding and helpful people are.
I love that. It's all about having a growth mindset when it comes to language learning. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
Absolutely. And the more you expose yourself to different varieties of English, the more you'll appreciate the richness and diversity of this language.
So as we wrap up this section on mastering phrasal verbs, any final words of wisdom for our listener?
Phrasal verbs are a vital part of the English language, and they're everywhere. They're like little keys that unlock a deeper level of fluency and understanding. Embrace the challenge, be patient with yourself, and most importantly, have fun with the process.
I love that. Learning a language should be an enjoyable experience, not a chore. So before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll uncover some common mistakes people make with phrasal verbs, what's one key takeaway you hope our listener will remember from this discussion?
I think the most important thing is to remember that phrasal verbs are everywhere in the English language. They're not something to be feared. Once you start paying attention, you'll be amazed at how often you hear and see them. Don't let them intimidate you. Embrace them as a key to unlocking a deeper level of fluency and sounding more natural in your everyday conversations.
And we're back for the final round of our deep dive into Take On. We've explored the meanings, the cultural nuances, and even some tips for mastering these tricky phrasal verbs. But now it's time to face the music, or should I say, face the mistakes.
You got it. Even the most seasoned English learners can stumble when it comes to phrasal verbs. But the good news is, by understanding these common errors, we can turn them into opportunities for growth.
Okay, so let's get right into it. What are some of the most frequent mistakes that English learners make with phrasal verbs? I bet our listener has encountered a few of these along the way.
One of the biggest stumbling blocks is figuring out if a phrasal verb is separable or inseparable.
Ah, yes, that age-old dilemma.
Right. Some phrasal verbs, like take on, can be separated by an object. You can say, she took on the project, or she took the project on. Both are perfectly fine.
But with others, you can't split them up, right?
Exactly. Like, look after. You can't say, I look my dog after. It has to be, I look after my dog.
So how is someone supposed to know which is which? Is there like a secret formula?
I wish there were. Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule. It really comes down to learning each phrasal verb on a case-by-case basis. And of course, a good dictionary is always your friend.
Another reason to love those dictionaries. Okay, so separable versus inseparable, that's a big one. What else trips people up?
Prepositions. Prepositions can be tricky. Using the wrong preposition with a phrasal verb is a very common mistake.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's stick with take. We've been talking about take on all day, which means to accept responsibility, right? But take off can mean to remove something or to depart, like a plane taking off.
So the verb stays the same, but that little preposition completely changes the meaning.
Exactly. It's like those prepositions hold a secret code that unlocks the true meaning of the phrasal verb.
Okay, so how can our listener avoid making this mistake?
Pay close attention to the context. Think about the overall meaning of the sentence and how the phrasal verb fits in. And, as always, a good dictionary can help you double-check your understanding.
All right, so we've got separable versus inseparable phrasal verbs. We've got prepositions to watch out for. What other linguistic landmines are lurking out there?
Well, another common mistake is using a phrasal verb in the wrong context.
Oh, right. Like some are more formal than others.
Exactly. Some phrasal verbs are perfectly acceptable in casual conversation, but might sound out of place in a formal setting, like a business presentation or an academic paper.
So it's like choosing the right outfit for the occasion. You wouldn't wear sweatpants to a wedding.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so context is key. Any other common phrasal verb faux pas we should warn our listener about?
Those are the big ones. But honestly, the best way to avoid making mistakes is to practice, practice, practice. And don't be afraid to experiment.
So true. The more you use phrasal verbs, the more comfortable and confident you'll become. So let's shift gears a bit. What are some fun and engaging ways our listener can practice using phrasal verbs?
One of my favorite methods is to watch movies and TV shows in English. But don't just passively watch. Really pay attention to how native speakers use phrasal verbs in dialogue. See if you can pick out the ones we've discussed today and try to figure out their meaning from the context.
It's like turning your living room into an English language immersion lab.
Exactly. And listening to music in English is another great way to tune your ear to phrasal verbs.
Ooh, I love that. Music is so catchy and memorable.
Right. Try reading along with the lyrics and see if you can spot any phrasal verbs. You'll be surprised how many you find.
What about reading books and articles? Can that help with phrasal verbs?
Definitely. Reading exposes you to a wider range of vocabulary and helps you see those phrasal verbs in action. You can even highlight them as you read, look up their meanings, and try using them in your own writing.
And let's not forget about word games. There are tons of online games and apps specifically designed to help you learn phrasal verbs. They make the learning process fun and interactive.
Those are all great suggestions. And the key takeaway here is that learning phrasal verbs doesn't have to be boring or tedious. If you find creative and engaging ways to practice, it can actually be a really fun part of your language learning journey.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into take on and the fascinating world of phrasal verbs, what's the most important message you want our listener to walk away with?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the process. Embrace those mistakes as opportunities to learn and grow. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
That's such a valuable reminder. Thank you so much for joining us on this linguistic adventure.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed exploring the many facets of take on and the broader world of phrasal verbs. Keep those ears open, those minds curious, and don't be afraid to take on the challenge of mastering this essential part of the English language. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the intricacies of English.